Welcome to History 112, Lecture 46, The Nixon Years, Crisis at Home and Abroad. Aside from Vietnam, Nixon's foreign policy really revolved around the transition of the world from being bipolar to multipolar. And Nixon was very eager to divide the communist nations. And China is very important to this because China did not get along with the Soviet Union. China's relations with the United States were bad. We did not officially recognize the existence of their country. And ultimately, China's paranoia had reached a stage where they feared an American-Soviet alliance against them. So Kissinger is sent to repair relations on a highly secret mission in 1971. And in February 1972, Nixon makes an official state visit to China, and this is all highly symbolic. While Nixon did not recognize the Chinese government officially, low-level relations began and Taiwan was expelled from the United Nations and replaced by Red China. Now from 1969 on, we're also in talks with the Soviet Union, and in 1972 we're going to read the SALT I Treaty, which freezes nuclear weapons levels at that level. So Nixon's going to engage in a lot of diplomacy to try to dial down the power of the communist bloc. First, by splitting off China and forming at least friendly relations with them, and two, by trying to calm down the nuclear arms race. Nixon's experiences in the mess that was Vietnam frame what's called the Nixon Doctrine, and the doctrine concerns how to deal with the Third World. For Nixon, the key idea was to maintain stable status quo without deep involvement in local disputes. So this means that we would help defend and develop what we call friends and allies, but the basic responsibility would be the problem of that nation. In other words, we would give money to any regime that was friendly, but would not intervene in their domestic affairs. So, for example, what happens in Chile is pretty illustrative. There's a Marxist named Allende who wins an honest election, and we fear that will push that country towards the Soviet camp, so we sponsor a military coup, and then we send development aid to that military regime, because we care more about are they pro-Soviet or pro-American than we care who's in charge of the country and how they act. One of the early challenges to the Nixon Doctrine is the Yom Kippur War. And the background of this is simple. Israel had routed Egypt and Syria and Jordan in the Six-Day War previously, and they had gained quite a bit of new territory, and this created a large Palestinian population and a number of Palestinian refugees who had fled to neighboring lands. And this becomes a source of instability for Jordan, who expels the Palestinians in 1970 due to the activities of an organization known as the PLO. Now, when Yom Kippur 1973 rolls around, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan invade again, and Israel is taken by surprise, and it takes Israel 10 days to mount a counteroffensive. However, once that counteroffensive is launched, the Israeli army is so successful that the United States has to intervene diplomatically before Israel beats Egypt too badly and destabilizes that nation. Now, Arab nations are going to respond with a brief oil embargo and refuse to sell to any nation friendly to Israel. And what we see here is the Third World is now more assertive, and they're going to play the United States and Soviet Union off against each other for their own benefit, and they're going to be willing to cut access to raw materials to gain diplomatic advantage. So the Third World is also becoming more assertive at the same time as Nixon is having to reevaluate how do we relate to these nations. On the domestic front, this is also a trying time for Richard Nixon because he's trying to reduce the role of the federal government and cut social program spending, and he is very much opposed to the use of things like busing and desegregating schools, although he favors the idea of desegregation itself. He's also going to refuse to let the government suspend funding to school districts that refuse to follow Supreme Court decisions regarding desegregation. He's going to also cut Great Society and New Frontier programs one at a time, and he's going to try to overhaul the welfare system to make it more efficient. And what Nixon came up with was a system that was actually better supported by many liberals, but it's killed by a strange alliance of welfare recipients, civil servants whose jobs would have been cut under Nixon's plan, and conservative politicians who oppose the very idea of welfare in the first place. For Richard Nixon, a constant source of discontent was the Warren Court, and most conservatives and what Nixon called the silent majority had been offended over the years by one or more of the Supreme Court decisions of the 50s or 60s. So we're talking about things like Roth v. United States, which limited the authority of local government to regulate obscene material, Engel v. Vitale, which takes away school prayer, Gideon v. Wainwright, which includes the right to a lawyer, Escobedo v. Illinois, the right to have a lawyer present during questioning, Miranda v. Arizona, the right to remain silent, and so on. And what people felt was that this was taking away local control to regulate what they saw as bad conduct and obscene conduct, and taking away people's rights in that regard, while also handing to what they saw as extensive rights to criminals. And most people that were of the conservative leaning at this time felt that this was highly inappropriate. Now, Nixon is going to try to place more conservative justices on the Supreme Court, and some are going to be rejected by the Senate, but over time he's able to appoint 4 fairly conservative justices, and as a result, the court becomes more moderate in some respects, but is also going to engage in quite a bit of judicial activism even after Nixon changed the balance of the court. Now, when the 1972 election rolls around, the news that peace was at hand in Vietnam did play a large role in sweeping Nixon back into the White House. But he did face a challenge from George Wallace, who had to drop out after an assassination attempt left him paralyzed, and the Democrats did run McGovern, who was extremely liberal, and in the end, the conservative majority, what Nixon called the silent majority, swept him back into office very comfortably. But there were economic troubles by 1972 that were pretty severe. LBJ's deficit spending had left a large debt. The United States had no longer had exclusive access to cheap raw materials throughout the world. The American economy was becoming increasingly dependent on Middle Eastern oil, and the manufacturing industry in the United States was in decline and was facing severe foreign competition, and factories were closing. And this was a time when they're transitioning to a knowledge-based industry, and industrial workers tend to have difficulty making that transition because industrial workers have skills, whereas knowledge-based economy are looking for things like degrees, and the people no longer have a skill set that matches up with the new economy. And when that is combined with out-of-control inflation, this is a general economic crisis. And the particular crisis that Nixon has was known as stagflation. Now, Nixon is going to cycle between curbing spending in order to combat inflation and keep the dollar at a viable level. But when he does that, he is doing so at the expense of economic growth. And he has to then increase spending to drive expansion, but that kicks inflation back in gear. And he's going to oscillate between two very different problems that both threaten to tear the American economy apart, and the result of Nixon's inability to strike a balance, and it was a time where striking a balance was going to be difficult, if not impossible to begin with. The result is one of the worst recessions in American history. While the economy ultimately put Nixon's second term off to a bad start, what really defined it was Watergate. Now, the United States had already at this time been engaged in a trend of giving more and more power to the president, and Nixon accelerated that in his first term. And he's going to consolidate all decision-making power in the Oval Office. And he did believe and did maintain that when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. And so Nixon is going to increasingly break laws and abuse the power on the belief that the president has the power to do what he feels is necessary. And in June 1972, during the run-up to the election, 5 men are arrested for breaking into the offices of a Democratic National Convention. And it was discovered that they were all working for Nixon's campaign and had been paid by campaign money controlled by White House staff. Now, slowly but surely, more and more is uncovered and national interest grows. And allegations of Nixon trying to stage a cover-up are going to be very prominent once his second term kicks into gear. And now, it's never proven that Nixon had advanced knowledge, but uncovered plenty of other questionable actions. Now, Nixon is going to appoint a special prosecutor to investigate, and the idea behind a special prosecutor is this: the Attorney General answers to the President. It will be inappropriate for the Attorney General to have to then investigate his own boss. So a special prosecutor is supposed to be theoretically independent and completely immune from presidential control. But when Cox makes some demands to Nixon about handing over certain recordings made in the Oval Office, Nixon fires him, and the Attorney General and a number of other senior members of his cabinet are going to resign in protest. Now, by 1973, Spiro Agnew, the vice president, is embroiled in a completely unrelated corruption scandal and is forced to resign. And as a result of the 25th Amendment, Gerald Ford becomes the next vice president automatically. Now, Ford was very well liked by Congress, whereas most of Congress had hated Agnew more than Nixon. But now that Agnew was gone and Agnew was seen as a bigger problem, the idea of removing Richard Nixon and putting someone like Gerald Ford into the White House seemed to be a much more attractive proposition. Now, the Supreme Court is going to ultimately rule against Nixon regarding some key evidence, and the evidence is going to reveal that days after the burglary, Nixon ordered the FBI to stop investigating the Watergate break-in. As a result of all of this, impeachment seems likely, and Nixon decides to resign several days later, and Gerald Ford becomes our only unelected president, and he is going to in turn pardon Richard Nixon, and that's going to lead to some allegations about potential corruption on Ford's part. So what's the big idea here? Well, for Nixon's second term, it's really about trying to maintain U.S. influence abroad while dealing with angry conservatives at home who want to end to reform and activism, while also trying to balance a deeply damaged economy during one of the worst economic crises in American history. And what ultimately proved to be Richard Nixon's undoing was the corruption scandal that followed the Watergate break-ins. See you in the next lecture.